I'm Grace Miller, 28, the daughter my family parades only to remind me I don't measure up. Tonight, beneath chandeliers that glitter like judgment, I realize it more clearly than ever. I was never meant to belong here. At every gala, my parents raised Daniel higher, polishing him as the heir, the legacy, the golden son. Every glass lifted in his honor feels like another brick in the wall they've built to keep me outside. My mother's smile curves sharp whenever her eyes find me. My father's silence cuts sharper than words. But tonight, he doesn't stay silent. He points me out across the ballroom and calls me the disappointment. The crowd laughs, their applause rising like a wave, and I stand there with their ridicule crashing over me. Yet somewhere inside, a flame refuses to go out. Ever been told you were nothing, loud enough for the world to hear? Hit like if someone ever dismissed your worth. Comment if you've ever been invisible at your own table. Because for me, it all began in this room under chandeliers burning too bright, with my father's voice slicing through the night like crystal breaking. My dress was plain, borrowed, a shade of navy that looked almost black in the flood of golden light. As I moved through the crowd, shoulders brushed past me like I wasn't there. Their perfume lingered longer than their glances. I told myself I'd grown used to it the way my parents' world swallowed me whole, then spat me back out like a bitter taste. But tonight felt different. Every ripple of laughter, every sideways glance seemed rehearsed, like the entire gala had gathered for the sole purpose of reminding me I didn't belong. My father's voice cut through the din, amplified by the microphone the hotel staff handed him as though it were a scepter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward Miller announced, raising a flute of champagne, "thank you for joining us tonight at the Miller Foundation Gala." His gray hair gleamed beneath the chandelier, every strand meticulously combed, as if even disorder would not dare approach him. He stood tall beside my mother, Margaret, draped in emerald silk that caught every glint of light, her jewels a declaration of permanence. On her arm, my brother Daniel, perfect smile, perfect suit, the golden heir to everything I was denied. My pulse quickened as I realized the stage was more than a platform. It was a throne room, and I was about to be humiliated within it. "Of course," Edward continued, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, "our family's future rests secure. Daniel has proven himself time and again, and the legacy of the Miller name is safe in his capable hands." A round of applause erupted. Guests clinked glasses in celebration, toasting the son who could do no wrong. I stood near the back, invisible. No one clapped for me. Not that they ever would. I could feel Margaret's eyes sweep across the crowd, pausing only when they landed on me. Her lips curled in the faintest smile, not warmth, not welcome, but satisfaction that I stood apart. She had orchestrated this divide long before tonight. Someone whispered behind me, just loud enough for the words to slice. "Is that the daughter? The one who paints, or writes, or whatever?" How quaint. A chorus of chuckles followed, brittle and rehearsed. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms, but I forced myself to keep still. Let them laugh. Let them think I was harmless. Edward raised his hand for silence. "And yes," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "I do have another child." Heads turned, eyes like daggers seeking their mark. He lifted his arm and pointed toward me. "That's my daughter, an artistic soul, but utterly disappointing." The laughter this time was not a ripple, but a wave. It washed over me, hot and suffocating. My ears burned as guests leaned toward one another, trading smirks and whispered judgments. Daniel stood taller, smirking in my direction, basking in the contrast Edward had just painted. Air and disappointment, light and shadow. For a moment, the air seemed to vanish from the room. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor beneath my feet. But somewhere deep inside, another impulse flickered. Not fear, not shame, something harder, sharper. The ridicule that echoed through the hall wasn't new. It was a refrain, one I had heard my entire life. Yet tonight, under the unforgiving glow of crystal and gold, I refused to bow to it. I lifted my chin, my gaze locked on my father's face, unwavering. He expected me to shrink, to crumble under his words. Instead, I let the silence between us harden, stretching taut like wire. The laughter around us blurred into static, irrelevant. All that mattered was this moment, my eyes meeting his, my spine straightened, my defiance plain. One day, that word will choke him. I learned early, silence hurts less than speaking into a void. The memory comes back sharp as glass the winter of 2008, when Daniel, 17 and untouchable, crashed his brand new BMW into the wrought iron gates of the Miller estate. Snow still clung to the hedges, and the engine smoke curled upward like an accusation. I remember standing in the doorway, wrapped in a sweater too small for me, watching the scene unfold as though it were theater staged for everyone but me. Edward was already outside, his coat thrown over his shoulders, voice lowered as he barked into his phone. Lawyers. He called them faster than he called an ambulance. Get this handled. No charges, no press. His words were curt, efficient, like he was signing a business deal rather than shielding his son from consequence. Margaret stood beside Daniel, brushing glass off his jacket, her hands trembling in false fragility. You're fine, sweetheart, just a scare. We'll keep this quiet. Don't you worry. I hovered in the background. No one asked if I was cold, or scared, or even awake past midnight. The wreckage lay in the driveway like a sculpture of destruction, twisted metal, broken glass, the car's hood bent like a crumpled page. Yet Daniel's grin was intact, cocky, already brushing it off like an anecdote he'd polish at parties. He winked at me as if daring me to tell. The next day, the house buzzed with whispered calls. Edward's study door stayed shut, his voice filtering through the oak. Threats, negotiations, promises of donations to keep authorities quiet. Margaret moved through the halls with an air of triumph, not fear the crisis already tamed, the story already spun. Meanwhile, I sat at the kitchen table with my sketchbook open, pencil hovering over blank paper. When Margaret finally noticed me, she sighed. What are you doing with that again? You waste so much time. I swallowed the question before it could slip out. But later, when Edward emerged from his study, I tried. Just once, my voice fragile but insistent. Dad, there's an art class at the community center. It's $50. Could I? He didn't even stop walking. Not now, Grace. Finances are tight this quarter. His tone carried no malice, just dismissal, as though my request belonged in the trash bin beside the morning paper. The irony burned. Money bled freely to silence police reports, but not a drop could be spared for me. A week later, the driveway gleamed with a new BMW, shinier, faster, untouched by Daniel's recklessness. The family gathered around it as if blessing an heirloom, Daniel revving the engine like a king reclaiming his throne. Edward clapped his son's back, Margaret kissed his cheek, and laughter spilled across the frosted lawn. I lingered on the edge, unnoticed, invisible, my breath clouding in the cold. When the crowd dispersed, I stepped closer. My fingers brushed the hood's polished surface, cold and smooth beneath my skin. In its reflection, I saw not just my face but the void my family carved around me, year after year. The ledger of unfairness tallied another entry, and the columns tilted further out of balance. If this is their balance sheet, I'll rewrite it someday. When I held the scholarship letter, I thought it would finally buy me their pride. Instead, it only saved them money. The envelope had been smooth and weighty in my hands, embossed with the blue seal of Georgetown. I'd torn it open in my room, heart pounding, eyes skimming over the words that felt like sunlight after years of shadow. Full academic scholarship. 4 years. Recognition of merit. For the first time, the world outside our estate had seen me, named me worthy. I carried the letter downstairs like it was a fragile artifact, expecting, even craving, the impossible. A spark of joy in their eyes, a moment of validation. Edward was in his leather chair by the fireplace, reading financial pages, Margaret perched nearby with a glass of wine. Their silence filled the room before I entered. Heavy, settled, like a fog that smothered anything tender. Dad, I began carefully, unfolding the letter with trembling fingers. I got a scholarship. Georgetown, full ride. The words hung in the air, bright and trembling, waiting to be embraced. Edward barely looked up. He set down his paper only long enough to glance at the page I held, his expression unreadable. That's practical, he said finally. Saves us tuition. He leaned back, already returning to the numbers that mattered more. Margaret gave a brief nod, as though approving a sensible purchase. Well, at least you won't be a burden, she murmured, her tone the same she used when complimenting a maid for cleaning quickly. The weight of their indifference crushed more than any outright insult. They didn't see achievement, they saw a discount. Every long night of study, every page written, every sacrifice distilled into a financial equation. It was as though my worth had been converted into a line item under savings. I thought of Daniel's Georgetown acceptance years earlier. They had thrown a gala in his honor. White tents in the garden, champagne fountains, a string quartet. Edward gave a speech about legacy. Margaret beamed in her pearls, and guests toasted Daniel's bright future. The memory stung like salt in an open wound. He hadn't needed a scholarship. His tuition was paid in full without hesitation, and still the world revolved around him. That night, the house pulsed with music and laughter for him. Tonight, when I held my own triumph in hand, the only sound was the faint rustle of Edward's newspaper and the clink of ice in Margaret's glass. No party, no speech, not even a smile. I retreated upstairs, the letter still clutched in my hand. I sat at my desk, staring at it under the lamplight, the words blurring as tears welled. Pride, I had believed, could be earned. Love, I thought, could be bought with effort, with proof. But the truth stared back at me in cold ink. Nothing I achieved would shift their scales. Daniel's victories were family triumphs. Mine were personal conveniences. The silence of the house pressed in, hollow and vast. I folded the letter carefully, pressing its creases sharp, as if neatness could disguise the ache. My chest felt tight, my stomach hollow. The scholarship was priceless to me, an escape, a chance to carve a life beyond their shadows. To them it was nothing more than a coupon. The phone rang, startling me from the spiral. I wiped my eyes quickly, answering on the second ring. A deep, measured voice came through, calm but intent. "Grace Miller? This is Professor Jonathan Reed. I'd like to meet you." No one had ever looked at me the way he did, as if my mind was a weapon. I had expected another faculty meeting about grades, perhaps a polite acknowledgement of achievement. Instead, Jonathan Reed's office was different. Shelves stacked with books in multiple languages, framed maps with notations in ink, curtains drawn against the December chill. The light came only from a desk lamp, catching the edges of his silver hair and the sharp glint of his glasses. He gestured for me to sit, his gaze steady, measured, as though he already knew more about me than I had told anyone. My scholarship letter peeked from my folder, the corners softened by my constant handling, but Reed didn't look at it. He looked at me. "I've read your essays," he said. His voice was calm, low, but it carried weight. "Your fluency, your analysis, they don't read like an 18-year-old struggling to impress. They read like someone who can break patterns others don't even see." Heat rushed to my face, half pride, half suspicion. No one in my family had ever spoken to me like that, not even close. Edward's voice was clipped commands. Margaret's was veiled dismissal. Reed's words felt dangerous because they acknowledged me, saw me. "I'm not sure what you mean," I murmured, though my pulse quickened. He leaned back, fingers steepled. "There are two paths for someone like you. The one your family imagines dutiful, visible, perhaps even successful in a conventional sense. But visible people can be crushed. The other path is covered, hidden, quiet, but powerful. Serving your country in ways no one applauds publicly, but everyone depends on privately." The words unsettled me. My instinct was to reject them. I had spent years clawing for recognition, dreaming that one day Edward and Margaret would look at me with pride instead of thinly veiled shame. What Reed offered wasn't visibility. It was erasure, a life in the shadows. "Why me?" I asked softly, almost defiantly. "I'm not Daniel. I'm not their golden child. I'm—" "Exactly," Reed interrupted, his eyes sharp. "Daniel's the kind of person enemies expect. You've been underestimated your entire life. That's your strength. You've learned to listen where others boast, to see cracks where others see walls. Do you want a life your family could never diminish?" The question struck deeper than any praise. For years I'd chased scraps of validation, offering them evidence of my worth. Grades, letters, awards. They never cared. What Reed offered wasn't their pride, it was freedom from needing it. My gaze drifted to the scholarship letter in my folder, the one that had once seemed like salvation and now looked pale, almost childish. My parents had treated it like a coupon, a cost-saving measure, a joke. My chest tightened. For so long I had wanted them to love me. But what if I stopped needing that? I inhaled, slow and unsteady, the weight of decision pressing down on me. The room felt charged, air heavy, with the possibility of transformation. My lips parted, and before doubt could stop me, the words slipped out in a whisper that seemed to echo louder than any declaration I had ever made. Yes, they thought I was a shadow. I was simply learning how to live in the dark. The mornings at the farm began before dawn, when the Virginia mist still clung to the fields like gauze and the air burned cold against our lungs. We rose from bunks in silence, our boots pounding gravel as we lined up for whatever trial waited. It was never announced until it began, sometimes a forced march, with packs weighted down until shoulders bled. Sometimes a test of silence in a room so small you felt your own heartbeat betray you. The instructors had no patience for excuses. Failure wasn't measured by bruises, but by hesitation, by the flicker of doubt in your eyes. I learned quickly that pain was not the enemy. Indifference was. When the others groaned or cursed, I kept my face steady, memorizing every pattern. I watched who reached for water too soon, who cracked under interrogation drills, who mistook brute force for strategy. And every time, I reminded myself, Edward and Margaret would never know this side of me. To them, I was still the fragile daughter, the disappointment. That invisibility was now my shield. The training grew harsher. One week they dropped us in dense woods with only a compass and a knife, forcing us to navigate back under pursuit. My legs trembled, lungs tearing as dogs barked in the distance. But I kept moving, slower, quieter, finding paths others missed. Another day, they locked us in mock cells, interrogators hammering us with threats and lies. I thought of my mother's cold eyes, my father's dismissive smirk, and silence became easy. They had already taught me endurance without ever intending to. At home, I played my role to perfection. I returned for meals at the Miller estate, sitting at the long oak table beneath chandeliers, nodding quietly while Daniel spoke of his finance internship, and Edward praised him. Margaret asked me only once about a scar on my arm, a thin red line that peeked from my sleeve. I smiled awkwardly, pretending I had tripped in a campus stairwell. She didn't press. Why would she? To her, I was clumsy, distracted, always one mistake away from collapse. They never noticed how steady my hands had become when I lifted my glass, how calmly I endured their jabs. They never saw the muscle built beneath my clothes or the sharpened gaze behind my lowered eyes. They didn't want to see, and that blindness became my camouflage. The field tests escalated. One night, in simulated pursuit, I misjudged a turn and found myself pinned against a ravine, flashlights and shouts closing in. My chest heaved, sweat stung my eyes. I could have panicked, could have leapt and broken bones. Instead, I pressed myself into shadow, slowed my breath, let the noise pass above. Minutes stretched into eternity. When the patrol moved on, I climbed the ravine inch by inch, palms torn, but alive. That survival earned me a new name. Afterward, an instructor scribbled on my file and said it aloud for the first time. Miles, short, clean, untraceable. Grace Miller was the invisible daughter. Miles was the asset who endured, who passed where others failed. In the barracks that night, as exhaustion dragged at every limb, a fellow trainee leaned across the bunk, eyes gleaming in the dim light. His voice was low, reverent, almost certain. Miles, you'll be a legend. By day, I was Grace Miller, the family's failure. By night, I was Miles, the analyst who decided which men lived or died. At Langley, the air was chilled, always faintly humming with servers and the quiet rush of people who carried secrets like second skin. The crisis briefing was thick with tension. A group of hostages trapped overseas, their captors broadcasting threats, demanding concessions. Analysts threw data across the table, voices layered with urgency. I listened, sifting through the noise. Patterns emerged, a phrase repeated in the intercepted calls, a supply route too regular, a weakness left unguarded. I leaned in, pointing to the map. They'll move them at dusk here. They trust this road. It's a mistake. The room paused. Senior officers shifted, checking the files again, and then nodded. Hours later, when the rescue team struck exactly where I had traced, the hostages were alive. Not because of bravado, not because of force, because Miles had read the silence between words and acted. My name would never appear in headlines, but the weight of lives spared pressed against me like a solemn crown. That evening, I returned to the Miller mansion. The table glittered as always. Polished silver, heavy crystal, conversations loud enough to make servants stiffen. Daniel raised his glass, smirking as he described his new Manhattan condo panoramic views, parties until dawn, deals whispered over champagne. My parents glowed with pride. I sat in the corner, the space they left for me, as though I might spill something. Edward leaned close across the noise, his breath tinged with bourbon. "Don't embarrass us," he muttered, the words sharp as glass. I thought of the men whose families would see them again because of me, of the maps I had burned into my memory, of the decisions that decided fate. And still, to him, I was the girl who didn't belong at his table. Later, in the dim light of the CIA cafeteria, A colleague clapped my shoulder. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried something heavier. You saved lives today, but to them, you'll always be invisible. The truth slid into me like a blade clean, inevitable. When I returned to my apartment that night, a thin envelope waited among the bills. My name wasn't on it. Daniel's was, engraved in heavy font, announcing the Miller Foundation Gala, November 2022. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the paper bite my skin, and knew the invitation wasn't for me. Every lie I told was to protect a truth bigger than myself. The dining room gleamed under the weight of chandeliers, polished to blinding perfection, as if the Miller family could buy holiness with crystal and silver. Daniel sat at the head of the conversation, his voice booming with the confidence of someone who had never known failure. He raised his glass to announce his promotion at the family firm, a deal sealed that would apparently change the company's trajectory. The applause from our parents rang louder than the clink of crystal rehearsed, certain, pride-laden. I pushed peas around my plate. The scar on my arm, thin but jagged, pulled when I lifted my fork. Margaret's eyes caught it. Her gaze lingered. "Office accident?" she asked, lightly, as if she had already filed away the story she wanted. I nodded, swallowing a lie with my sip of water. The truth, a midnight survival drill, barbed wire tearing skin while I crawled under the cold Virginia rain, would never belong at this table. Daniel smirked, taking the moment as another reminder of my awkwardness. Edward raised his glass again, drawing attention back to the golden sun. "At the next gala," he announced, savoring the weight of his words, "Daniel will be named the official heir to the Miller Foundation. It is time for the world to see who carries our name with dignity." My stomach turned cold. The gala was months away, yet its shadow loomed over the table, thick and suffocating. I forced a smile, the kind that hurt more than silence, and let my father's words settle like chains across my shoulders. "At least Daniel knows how to carry the family's name with pride," Edward added, twisting the knife. I excused myself early, leaving the echo of their laughter behind. In the solitude of my room, I locked the door, the laughter replaced by the rustle of classified paper. From beneath the floorboard, I drew out a folder marked in red ink. Miller Foundation Financial Irregularities. The edges were sharp, the words inside sharper. My father thought inheritance was a crown. I knew it was a loaded gun. He looked at me as if he had been waiting for this moment for me to see what he already knew. The cafe near Langley buzzed with quiet chatter, the smell of roasted beans heavy in the air. But everything dulled the moment Jonathan Reed sat across from me. He hadn't aged much since Georgetown, same sharp gray eyes, same tailored calm. He placed his cup down gently, his movements rehearsed, controlled, like every gesture carried a message I had yet to decode. "I warned you, Grace," he said, his voice low enough to merge with the clink of spoons on saucers. "The agency is circling your family's foundation. They're watching the flows of money, the irregularities." I stiffened, though I tried to mask it behind a casual sip of coffee. "Let them watch. It's not my concern anymore." Reed studied me for a beat too long, like he could see the scars under my skin, the nights I had spent in shadows, the lies I carried back to my parents' table. His expression softened, almost pitying, before he leaned closer. "Grace, truth doesn't need your permission. It will find its stage, and whether you stand in the light or the dark, you'll be part of it." I wanted to scoff, to insist that my family's affairs were ashes I had already buried. Yet the words clawed at me, because I knew the stage he spoke of, the Miller Foundation Gala, the glittering circus where my father displayed Daniel like a crown jewel while I became little more than a discarded footnote. "I don't care about their gala, or their name," I muttered, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. "They've never cared about me." Reed's smile was subtle, the kind that unnerved more than comforted. "It doesn't matter if you care. The truth cares about you." I looked away, staring through the cafe window at the blurred motion of commuters. I hated how his words rooted inside me, how easily they unearthed the ledger of grudges I swore I'd buried. My phone vibrated. I slid it open under the table. A secure text glowed across the encrypted screen. "Prepare for assignment. Target overlaps with Miller Foundation Gala." The coffee soured in my throat. Reed said nothing, but the way he folded his hands told me he already knew. On the surface, it was a celebration. Beneath, it was a battlefield. The Miller estate had never been so loud, so full of glittering chaos. Trucks unloaded crates of champagne, Photographers scoped the grounds for their best angles. The staff moved like soldiers, adjusting lights, polishing marble, ensuring that not a single blemish would remain when the gala arrived. I stood at the edge of the frenzy, invisible as always, watching the family empire prepare to crown its chosen heir. Edward occupied the library, the grandest room of the house, where the ceiling bore a painted mural of gods and victories. He practiced his speech before a gilt mirror, voice rolling with pompous assurance. "Tomorrow," he declared to his reflection, "the Miller Foundation will usher in a new era. Daniel will stand as my successor. He will carry our name with the dignity it deserves." I leaned against the doorframe, silent, unseen. The words were not rehearsal, they were prophecy. Later, Margaret found me by the staircase. Her gown was draped across her arm, emerald silk that shimmered under the chandelier. Her eyes flickered over me, weary, cautious, as though I were a child caught stealing candy. "Grace," she said softly, almost pleading, "just smile tomorrow. Don't ruin his night." Her warning wasn't for me. It was for Daniel, for Edward, for their illusion of perfection. That night, the family gathered at the dining table, though no one really ate. Daniel relished the attention, basking in Edward's approval. He spun stories of new ventures, partners lining up to invest, as though his hands alone built empires. My father raised his glass, pride etched deep into his face. Then his gaze found mine, and the air shifted. "Tomorrow," Edward said, his voice steady, deliberate. "You'll replace me at the center, Daniel. Grace will stay where she belongs in the shadows." The laughter that followed was soft but deadly. Daniel smirked, Margaret smiled thinly, and I swallowed every shard of their dismissal like broken glass. Hours later, I stood alone in my room, the mansion quiet but still humming with anticipation. I opened my dresser drawer. Silk brushed my fingers the gala dress Margaret had chosen for me, tasteful but subdued, meant to fade against diamonds and lights. Beneath it, cold and unyielding, lay my CIA badge. 2 lives stared back at me, one draped in satin, the other engraved in steel, and tomorrow they would collide. The applause roared for Daniel, but the only sound I heard was the countdown in my head. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom glittered brighter than I remembered, chandeliers burning like artificial suns, mirrors multiplying every diamond and every champagne bubble into infinity. The air was heavy with perfume, money, and praise, all directed toward Daniel, who stood beneath the spotlight as if the room had been built for him alone. His smile was wide, trained, the kind that convinced investors, donors, and sycophants alike that he was a prince ordained by blood and brilliance. The crowd cheered when Edward raised his glass, his voice booming through the speakers, each word sculpted like scripture. "Tonight we celebrate the future of the Miller Foundation and of our family legacy." Guests erupted into applause again, laughter ringing across crystal glasses. My brother basked in it, his shoulders back, head high, the air apparent. I stood near the edge of the floor, my dress chosen to blend rather than dazzle. To them, I was furniture, decoration, a shadow they couldn't be bothered to erase. A senator, drunk on his own self-importance, leaned toward Edward with a smirk. "And your daughter? Grace, isn't it? What path has she taken?" Edward's laughter sliced the room, crueler than the champagne's sparkle. "Grace? She's our disappointment. Dabbling in meaningless work, wasting her education on projects no one understands. Every family has one." The table chuckled. Even Margaret's lips curved, thinly, as if agreeing with his cruelty were easier than defying him. Heat seared my face, but I didn't move. I wanted to scream, to throw the weight of my hidden years into their smug eyes, but all I could do was stand there, erased again. Daniel bowed theatrically, as though their mockery of me were a backdrop to his triumph. "Don't worry," he said lightly. "I'll make up for her." The crowd laughed harder, as if betrayal were comedy. I turned, the room tilting under me, rage and humiliation pounding in my chest. My eyes caught the tall mirrored wall, 1,000 reflections of me, dressed in silk, swallowed by shadows. My pulse counted down. 3, 2. The ballroom doors slammed open. The sound cracked through applause like a gunshot. Heads swiveled. Murmurs rippled. 4 agents stepped inside, their black suits cutting through sequins and gowns like knives through silk. The air shifted instantly, laughter shriveling into silence. Agent Carter led them, her stride unwavering, heels striking the marble with the authority of inevitability. She didn't glance at Edward, or Daniel, or the senator still clutching his drink. Her eyes found mine across the glittering room, and the silence became suffocating. Agent Miles, she said, her voice clear, carrying over the stunned crowd. The director is waiting. Every head turned, every glass stilled midair. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. Every head turned. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible daughter, I was the storm in the room. The Waldorf Astoria ballroom, a moment ago drenched in laughter and applause, had gone silent enough to hear the faint hum of the chandeliers. Agent Carter's heels struck the marble with steady precision as she crossed the floor, slicing through the glittering crowd like a blade through silk. Her gaze never wavered from mine. Gasps rippled among the guests. Women's jeweled fingers froze halfway to their champagne glasses. Men shifted in discomfort, whispers already racing from ear to ear. Agent? One muttered, disbelief tightening the word. I stood motionless, dress shimmering beneath the lights, but I no longer felt like the clumsy ornament they mock. The air around me changed, thick with revelation, my double life bleeding into the open. Edward surged forward from his table, his voice trembling with outrage more than command. Excuse me, this is my family's event. Whatever business you have, it does not concern my daughter. His hand cut through the air, dismissive, desperate to smother the moment before it could ignite. But Carter didn't spare him a glance. She stopped in front of me close enough that her shadow merged with mine, and said once more, louder, sharper, Agent Miles. The words detonated. Gasps became a wave, some guests clutching their pearls, others leaning forward, hungry for scandal. Daniel's glass slipped from his hand, shattering at his feet. Margaret's breath caught audibly, her manicured fingers tightening around her chair. I felt the burn of their stares, but it no longer stung. For years I had been the disappointment, the overlooked one, the name they spoke with pity or derision. Tonight, the label inverted itself. In their silence, I was no longer erased. I was the center, the storm. Edward's face flushed crimson. He stepped toward Carter, his voice cracking with fury. You will not humiliate my family like this. She is nothing but enough. Carter's command sliced through the ballroom. Steel and final. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her authority drowned his. And then it happened, the spotlight, literally and metaphorically, shifted. The chandeliers seemed to bend toward me, every eye anchoring to where I stood. The girl they had laughed at, dismissed, diminished, was no longer theirs to define. She was something else, something they couldn't control. The doors boomed open again. Heads swiveled as the echo rolled like thunder. A figure stepped inside, composed, deliberate, carrying a weight that stilled the room more thoroughly than any shout could. Director Hayes entered. His presence radiated calm power, the kind that made Edward's bluster look like the tantrum of a fading monarch. The crowd parted instinctively, reverence and fear mingling in the hush. And as Hayes's eyes found mine, I knew the stage had shattered. Nothing about this room, this family, or my life would ever be put back together the same way. He didn't walk. He owned the room, with silence as his weapon. Director Hayes moved with a precision that silenced even the whispers, the way a tide sweeps over sand and leaves no trace of noise behind. His steps were measured, deliberate, but each one carried the weight of inevitability. The crowd seemed to lean toward him as if the very air had been pulled in his direction. I had seen power before, sitting in war rooms, listening to voices decide the fates of men who never knew their names. But this was different. Hayes wasn't performing for cameras or allies. He radiated the kind of authority that did not ask to be recognized. It simply was. Edward straightened at his approach, shoulders squared, lips twitching into the polite smile of a man accustomed to greeting senators and CEOs. He half-stepped forward, eager to seize the moment, to spin it. Director Hayes, what an honor to have you here. Hayes walked past him without a pause, without a glance. It was as though my father had evaporated into the marble. The director stopped directly in front of me, his eyes, gray and unflinching, locked onto mine. For the first time since the doors had burst open, the tremor in my chest steadied. His presence anchored me. He didn't see Grace the disappointment, Grace the shadow. He saw Miles the analyst who had carried dossiers through fire, who had drawn red lines on maps that determined life or death. Agent Miles, he said, his voice low but carrying across the ballroom. You'll brief me on tonight's development immediately after this engagement. The situation requires your eyes. There was no disguise in his tone, no attempt to veil my identity behind diplomatic phrasing. Every guest, every camera that had been raised in the chaos, caught his words. The whispering erupted like a storm, flowing from table to table, champagne flutes clinking in nervous hands. The Miller's forgotten daughter. The family's shame. A CIA agent. Margaret's face had gone paper white, her pearls trembling against her throat. Daniel shifted beside her, his knuckles white against the back of his chair. Edward, though, stood frozen, mouth slightly parted, as though some invisible hand had struck him silent. Hayes turned to him then, finally granting him notice. His expression remained calm, almost courteous, but his words cut with surgical precision. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for raising one of our nation's most valuable assets." The pause after the sentence carried venom. It wasn't gratitude, it was a knife, slipped between the ribs of my father's vanity. Around the room, a ripple of recognition passed. The statement wasn't praise, it was an indictment, a reminder that Edward's pride had built a pedestal for his son, while ignoring the child who had become something he could neither control nor diminish. Edward's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his temple. He opened his mouth, but nothing emerged. His empire of control, so carefully maintained through ridicule and dismissal, cracked beneath the weight of a truth he couldn't spin. I stood taller, the silk of my dress heavy against my skin, but the badge hidden beneath it burning like a brand. Reed's words echoed in my mind. Truth will find its stage. Tonight, it had. As the applause faltered and the crowd recoiled between awe and gossip, a small voice broke the silence at our table. Daniel, pale as bone, shook his head, his lips curling in disbelief. "No!" His voice cracked, raw with fear. "No, she's lying. She's a fraud." And just like that, the battlefield shifted again. It took 20 years for them to build their story. It took 20 seconds for me to destroy it. The ballroom no longer shimmered with champagne light. It buzzed with a sharp, electric panic. Guests huddled in cliques, whispers darting like arrows. Phones were raised at every angle, the red dots of cameras blinking. The Miller family, once the flawless tableau of wealth and control, stood under a spotlight that no chandelier could soften. Daniel's face was the first to crack. Red blotches climbed his neck, his breath quickened, and he pointed at me with a trembling hand. "She's betrayed the country." His voice pitched too high, too frantic, not the confident baritone of the heir they all admired. It was the sound of desperation. The crowd gasped, half believing, half hungry for scandal. My mother clutched at her pearls, shaking her head, as though denying the words could stitch together the unraveling threads. Edward's eyes narrowed, a flicker of strategy returning. "Yes," he snapped, seizing Daniel's cry. "That's what this is. Grace has kidnapped this family, twisted her bitterness into treason. She wants to ruin us." Before the panic could snowball, Carter moved forward with a tablet in hand. His voice cut through the noise like steel against glass. Director Hayes authorized the release of these files. The screen lit up, and across it flickered rows of transaction records, offshore accounts, shell corporations. Daniel Miller wire transfers linked directly to sanctioned entities. Money laundering tied to arms deals. Your golden son has been feeding at poisoned wells. Gasps turned into gasps of recognition. The names of the entities were known, whispered in Washington hallways. Reporters surged forward, cameras snapping, recording every line. Daniel staggered back. "No, no, that's fabricated. That's—" His eyes darted wildly, searching for his father. Edward stepped closer, trying to shield him, but the damage was already bleeding into the air. Margaret whispered, "Edward, my God." But he wouldn't meet her eyes. I stepped forward, the crowd parting as though gravity itself had shifted. My voice came out steady, a quiet hammer against the chaos. "You were given everything." My gaze locked onto Daniel's, unflinching. "I earned everything. That's the difference." The words landed like a verdict. Daniel flinched, the fragile armor of his privilege collapsing in full view of the world. Edward tried to rally, but his power drained with every click of a camera shutter, every hushed murmur from the donors and senators who had once bowed to him. And then the reporters broke through. Microphones surged, flashbulbs burst like artillery. "Mr. Miller, is this true? Agent Miles, did you uncover this? Director Hayes, will there be an arrest?" The Miller legacy, carefully polished for decades, shattered in real time. Its collapse wasn't private or quiet. It was televised, recorded, immortalized in the digital bloodstream of the nation. The sound wasn't laughter anymore. It was ruin, and it was live. A man who once commanded boardrooms now begged through static-filled phone lines. The Miller mansion, once the fortress of certainty and pride, felt like a mausoleum in December's gray light. The stone walls seemed colder, the portraits of ancestors sterner, as if they too disapproved of the downfall. Edward prowled the study like a caged animal, the leather of his chair creaking as he slammed it back after each failed call. His voice, once the smooth timbre that sealed mergers and bent senators, cracked with each unanswered plea. "Bill, it's Edward Miller. Yes, I know what you've heard, but it's exaggerated." The call ended. He stared at the receiver as though it had betrayed him. Then another. "Frank, listen. We go back 30 years. Don't tell me you believe those files." Another click. Another silence. He gripped the phone until his knuckles whitened, muttering, "Every door opens when I knock." But the doors were not just closed now. They were barred, locked, and bricked over. Upstairs, Margaret sat at her writing desk, ink smudged across her trembling fingers. Her cursive bled with desperation as she wrote to me. She didn't ask me to forgive Edward or herself, only begged for Daniel. "Please, Grace," the letter read, "he is lost, but he is still our son. Help him. You can't let him drown." She blotted a tear, sealed the envelope with a shaking hand, and sent it into the world like a prayer. But Daniel was already drowning, and he had chosen the tide. He staggered through the halls, reeking of scotch, eyes bloodshot, tied dangling like a noose. "They stole it from me!" he shouted at the marble walls, as if the chandeliers themselves had conspired. "That throne was mine! Mine!" He hurled a glass into the fireplace, where it shattered and hissed against dying embers. Margaret recoiled from him, Edward ignored him, and the house listened, heavy with decay. At Langley, the world was cleaner. The corridors smelled of coffee and policy, not of desperation. My desk bore no heirlooms, only the crisp order of files and the hum of fluorescent lights. When Margaret's letter reached me, tucked between secure briefings, I read it once, without pause, without flinch. The plea was handwritten, aching in every curve of ink. I folded it carefully, placed it in the shredder, and watched the machine devour it into ribbons. No smoke, no ashes, just silence. The act required no triumph. It was not vengeance, nor mercy. It was absence, the final subtraction of need, of hope, of tether. As the strips of paper fell into the bin, I felt nothing but the clarity of distance. They had wanted me to be invisible. Now I was beyond them, unreachable. I looked out the Langley window at the December dusk, the glass reflecting neither mansion nor legacy, only the shadow I had chosen and mastered. My lips parted, the words so soft they belonged more to the air than to me. The storm is over, and so is my need for them. The shredder clicked off. The silence afterward was absolute. For years, I begged for a seat at their table. Now, I lead one of my own. The room was nothing like the chandeliers of Waldorf or the polished oak of the Miller estate. No velvet chairs, no wine glasses gleaming like trophies of lineage. Instead, steel gray walls, the low hum of projectors, a map of the world spilling its borders across the screen in glowing blue lines. The CIA strategy briefing room had no need for opulence. Here, power was measured in information, not inheritance. I stood at the head of the table. My table. The analysts shifted in their chairs, pens stilled, eyes fixed on me. Director Hayes sat at the far end, quiet but intent, his hands folded, giving me the stage with a subtle nod. Satellite intercepts confirm movement through Istanbul. I began, my voice calm, clipped, every word clean of hesitation. The funds trail crosses Zurich before bleeding into shell accounts in Dubai. If we act now, we can cut the network before it stabilizes. If we wait, I tapped the screen, the map pulsing with red, we'll be chasing ghosts. A murmur of agreement ran through the team. No one looked past me. No one waited for another voice to validate mine. I was not background here. I was the axis of the room. Hayes leaned back, appraising. The same calm gravitas he had wielded at the gala now turned toward me, but it was different here. Respect, unbarbed. "Good work, Agent Miles," he said, and the words carried no sting, no irony. Just truth, just wait. For a moment, my father's voice threatened to echo the old taunts, the dismissal, the word disappointment like a brand burned into me. But it didn't land anymore. The room around me swallowed it whole, and I was left with silence. My silence, my power. I felt it then, not as revelation but as certainty I had long been circling. I was home. I belonged to no Miller ledger, no family name carved on foundations I never touched. My identity was not a wound anymore. It was the weapon I had forged. "I don't need their validation anymore," I said aloud. The words were steady, unflinching, and the room didn't flinch either. They only nodded, as if it had always been obvious. Then the projector flickered. A new feed lit the wall, updated mission details, coordinates blinking across North Africa. The room straightened, pens clicked, the gears of duty grinding forward. Hayes looked at me. No father's approval. No heir's crown. Just expectation, trust, and wait. I rose, pushing the chair back. The world glowed across the map, fractured and waiting. My pulse steadied, and my voice came out low, certain. Time to work. The screen shifted again, the room tightening into focus, and the future opened with it. Betrayal had once defined her life, but in the end it became the crucible that revealed her strength. Justice arrived not with a whisper, but with the collapse of lies and the rise of a truth too powerful to ignore. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime proof that no empire built on deceit can endure. Sometimes it only takes one step into the light to end years of silence in the shadows. If you felt her fight resonate, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and drop your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you connected with her struggle. Comment 2 if you felt something was still missing.